New Thought Media Network is proud to present New Thought's Roots and Branches with Reverend Dr. Ruth Miller. Join us every Tuesday at 4 p.m. Mountain Time. Tune in live or watch anytime on our YouTube channel. Discover the rich history of New Thought and its impact on modern spirituality. Join Reverend Dr. Ruth Miller as she shares insights, stories, and teachings that inspire and uplift. Experience deep insights and transformative teachings that connect you to the roots of New Thought. Visit our YouTube channel to catch up on past episodes and join us live every Tuesday at 4 p.m. Connect with us and be part of the journey.
Well, hello there. I am Ruth Miller, and this is New Thought, Roots and Branches on the New Thought Media Network. And it's an honor to be here and to share with you some of the stories, some of the amazing discoveries and insights that individuals have had along the journey that created this movement that we call New Thought. In the first couple of shows, I gave you some of the prehistory, if you will, the history during the ancient Greek and Roman times and the development of the Christian church and other places, the Hindu and the Taoist traditions as well. And then this last show, we talked a little bit about some of the people who were in Europe, bringing forth the ideas that Emerson and others adopted. And today we're going to talk about Emerson, Ralph Waldo Emerson, the American philosopher from the 1800s. So we're going to look at the chart overall. Our first slide today is a reminder of the complexity of all the many people and teachings and ministries that have woven together this movement. We're going to be at the very top almost with Ralph Waldo Emerson. And then our next slide will show where Ralph fits in the context of the history that led into this movement. So there he is right about the middle of that page. So he drew heavily on both Eastern and Western philosophical and religious traditions in helping himself and the people around him understand what is really happening in our world. So Ralph himself, as you'll see in the next slide, did evolve, as all human beings do. And we're going to look at each of these stages in his life and what he was thinking at those stages and how that helps us today understand more fully what we are being and doing in this world. We'll start with his childhood in the next slide. Ralph Waldo Emerson was the son of Reverend William Emerson, who was one of several generations of highly respected teachers in the Boston area, ministers in the Boston church. And the church in Boston was congregational, which is to say the congregation owned and ran it. It was not part of a larger bishopry or anything like that. He was the second of 5 sons. Now, it turned out that one of those sons never really grew up mentally. So there were 4 of them who were active in the world. And it happened that reading was their number one activity. Everyone would come home from doing whatever, chores or playing or school, and curl up by the fire in the living room with a book. And our young Ralph Waldo Emerson was considered a little bit behind because he wasn't reading very clearly at the age of 3. He also tended to do pretty silly things, and he loved to draw, and he would make poetry rather than read these important texts. So it was a way to grow up which kind of separated him out, as many of us have experienced, I'm sure. His father would go off and do the work of a minister, which in that time was spending hours to write a sermon that would last an hour or more, and to visit all the various parishioners that were part of the congregation, providing counseling, sometimes asking for money, lots of visits. And William was very good at that. The Emerson family, as I said, had a great reputation in the community. His mother was equally spiritual. She would set up the household, and after the boys had gone off to school, or if they were set up doing what they were doing, she would adjourn to her room where she would pray and journal for 2 hours every day. And then she would come down and do all the other things that kept a household together in the 1900s. In the next stage of Ralph Waldo's life, we encounter in the next slide that his father passed on. Ralph Waldo was 8 years old that year. He'd had kind of an iffy relationship with his father. Among other things, his father decided he needed to learn to swim, and so just pushed him off the pier into the ocean, which was a little scary, to say the least. But when he died, of course, Ralph and all the boys were mourning deeply. Fortunately, the congregation was in a place where they could allow the family to stay in Pastor Williams' home. And they were not given any money, but they had a place to stay. So the mom sold off the library, William Emerson's library, which became the Athenaeum in Boston, and it is still there. They were very, very broke, literally. They weren't poor because they were rich in ideas and thinking, but they were broke. So broke that there was one coat that was shared by these boys as they went to school. One coat rotated among each of the boys who could wear it, which was the three in the middle. And it got to be a joke at the school. Okay, who gets to wear the coat today? Again, setting at least Ralph Waldo's sense of self apart from everyone else. The eldest son started a pattern. He managed to get through Harvard on a scholarship and by working. And then as soon as he got out of school, he started sending money back as a teacher. And that then let the next one go to school at Harvard and so on. And at 14, our young man, who now was no longer Ralph, but was just Waldo, at 14 became a student at Harvard University among 16-year-olds. Again, a little bit separated from all the others that were attending, just a little young. He wanted very much to be a poet or a painter. He really thought that was what his life's work was. As I said, he was making poetry and making sketches all the time. And he studied all the things everyone studied in those days, a basic liberal arts program, and tried to get a little extra on the side in studying poetry and painting. He also, as his elder brother had done and all the others would do after him, worked on the campus to help cover his expenses. And he was able to send money home while he was in college. That entered into his adolescence. So he's in college at Harvard as an adolescent. And you'll see in his next slide that probably the most important thing during that year or those years at Harvard, that stage in his life, were his correspondences, his letters to and from his father's sister, Mary. And as you can see in the slide, Tnamurya was the name that he gave to Aunt Mary. He messed up the letters a little bit. And he would tell her about what was going on in his life. And she would come back with these very intense phrases that were, designed to lift him up and to get him through this process. So he graduated from Harvard at 18. He was the class poet. Clearly, he had continued to write poetry. And then he began to start teaching, as had his brother before him. At that point, the church gave up the house, told them to give up the house, actually, and moved them all to Roxbury, which at that time was a tiny town on the edge of Boston. He got his younger brother through college, and he continued to study whenever he could and go to every lecture he could. And one of his favorite lecturers was a man who had also graduated from Harvard a few years before he had, William Ellery Channing. And Channing was just marvelous. He loved listening to this man. Well, it turned out Channing was on the board of Harvard and was instrumental in getting the Harvard Divinity School established. And in that process was bringing something that became known as Unitarianism into the United States. It had been sort of present before, but not institutionalized until Channing created that divinity school. Nonetheless, going to lectures, studying, and teaching, Ralph was not happy. Waldo, as he called himself, was not really happy. And as we go into the next slide, we find out that his elder brother, who went to Germany to study for the ministry, became a lawyer instead. And Aunt Mary said, "Oh, Mom, there's always been a minister and always will be an Emerson minister, a Reverend Mr. Emerson in Boston." And because Waldo was next, he was called on to fill the gap. So he got to go to the Harvard Divinity School that William Ellery Channing had established. And he graduated and was ordained in 1826. So that gives us a sense. He's 23 years old. He was born in 1803, and he is now an ordained minister. For what it's worth, that's 3 years younger than Martin Luther King was when he was ordained. It was a pretty powerful thing to have happen at that early an age. However, from that day on, people referred to him as Mr. Emerson or the Reverend Mr. Emerson. As we go forward in time, you can see that young picture of him. This is the Reverend Mr. Emerson, who is being set up to be a minister in Boston. By 1827, as we'll see in the next slide, he had been speaking around and was not doing very well. As I said, he was unhappy in 1819, 1820. He went into the ministry. He was very excited with the studies and was very pleased to work with Mr. Channing, but he nonetheless became very ill. And any of you who have ever listened to me before will remember how often I remind us what life was like in the 1800s in the United States, where very few streets were paved. Everyone had an open fireplace. If you were in an urban area, there were also factory smoke. There were probably cows, horses, dogs, chickens, and cats and rats and all kinds of things in and around the house. And there were no vacuum cleaners, and carpets were not properly cleaned. So everything you could possibly think of to irritate the respiratory system was common. And Waldo was one of the many people who succumbed. So he spent the winter of 1827 in the South to recover. And while he was there, he met Napoleon's nephew, a man named Murat, which you may have heard of in other stories of that time period. Finally, in the spring, he felt well enough, and he went around and preached in various Unitarian churches. And in 1829, 2 years after he got back, he was called to be the assistant minister at the Second Church in Boston. He would deliver sermons once or twice a month, and he wouldn't take a passage out of the Bible and do this scholarly expression and expansion on it. Instead, he would talk about these homely things, and he would use the Bible to illustrate or to explain these homely experiences. Some people liked that. Some people were not very impressed. But he had a job, he had an income, and he could finally marry the woman who was the love of his life, Ellen Tucker. They married and they had a child. And soon after they had their first child, the senior pastor was on sabbatical for 6 months, and Waldo had to take on all of the processes that the senior minister did, which included, as had for his father, preparing these long sermons and visiting all the parishioners on a regular basis. And Waldo discovered, with this idea of I'm not the same as everyone else that he'd clearly grown up with, that visiting the parish members was a very uncomfortable process. And then a big thing happened. It was Easter. And now he's senior pastor, and that means that he has to deliver what everyone expected at Easter. And that is a tradition that came out of the Roman Church. That is, everyone takes communion at Easter. And that had somehow not gotten dropped between the Reformation of the 1500s and the various evolutions of congregational churches in the States by the mid-1800s or the 1830s. So Emerson's going, wait a minute, if we are essentially Unitarian and Jesus is not a God, and sacrifice is not part of what all of this is about, why are we doing communion? And he canceled communion for Easter. And the board of trustees, the board of elders went, whoa, no. You don't get to do that, or words to that effect. So they sent him home and with the idea that he needed to decide if he really wanted to be a minister. And that happened very much at the same time that the love of his life died of the respiratory illness, which was at that time called consumption. So there he is. His wife has died. He's being called on the carpet for being true to the teachings. And he decides, I'm not going to be a minister. So in the next slide, we find out the next spring, he was out of there. And he was told to go home and think about it, and he was gone. Spring of 1832. This was too much. And from his journal, I really appreciate that he took the time to say this. I have sometimes thought that in order to be a good minister, it was necessary to leave the ministry. The profession is antiquated. In an altered age, he said, we worship in the dead forms of our forefathers. None of us have ever experienced that. So he got on a ship and traveled to Europe. Well, before he got on that ship, he wrote a letter to his friend Murat. And if we look at the next slide, we will see that his friend Murat was able to set up all kinds of invitations. And those of you who watched the last show and were wondering why I chose those particular illustrations of the Transcendental Movement and the Enlightenment in Europe, it's because those are the people that Ralph Waldo Emerson was able to visit during that year of 1832. That was really the concretization of his thinking. He arrived in Venice via a sailing ship, I think, in 1832. I don't remember, actually. But he arrived in Venice, and Murat had written letters of introduction. And he worked his way up from that part of Italy and worked his way up through Switzerland into France and Germany. And in France, he ended up in Versailles, and then he went up into England. And what he saw over and over and over again were the amazing differences between the way the Europeans were doing things and the way Americans were doing things. He saw the Europeans as being deeply entrenched in the past, and the American way as being very fresh and new. And he also saw that there were wonderful things to bring forward from the past, but not necessarily to be attached to. At Versailles, there's a set of gardens, and if you visited, you may possibly have seen them. And the way those gardens were set up, he could see how the plant it looks like a berry, and might even be a berry, like a blackberry or a raspberry, is very closely related to a plant that is basically rose hips with a little bit of blossom, all the way to the mature roses with their beautiful blossoms, sometimes as large as a dinner plate. And he could see that with a number of plants, peas and potatoes. He could see their evolution in the way the garden was set up. And that sparked something in him because he'd grown up in these long walks between Boston and Cambridge and seeing all the nature in the area. And he could see here the orderly progression and evolution of life. And it gave him that sense of order in everything. So when he returned to the U.S. in 1833, he realized he had enough money to buy a small home in Concord, Massachusetts, and he called it Bush. I've often wondered why. I haven't found any description of why. But for him, that bush was a place where he could nest, right? And he could feel that orderliness of nature. which is interesting because on his way home, he stopped in Boston and spent some time with the family. And he was sitting in the Athenaeum, which was his father's library, now made public. And he wrote a series of paragraphs that later he published as an essay called Nature. It's his first writing. And Nature, he didn't put his name on. He published it anonymously. If we go on to the next slide, you can see how the next part of his life begins to unfold. He realizes at that point that nature is a language, that orderliness, those processes, that fact, that this fact, as he says, every new fact is a new world, a new word in a new world of language, right? But it's not a language taken to pieces and dead in the dictionary. And that's an interesting concept because in English, we tend to write things down and then catalog them like a dictionary, and that takes the life out of them. Whereas indigenous languages don't work that way. And in fact, many indigenous people will refuse to have anything to do with writing their language down because they don't want it to be dead like that. But he goes on in his uses of natural history, those paragraphs that led into that essay, Nature. I wish to learn this language, yes, not that I may know this new grammar, right, he says, but that I may read the great book that is written in that tongue. So that idea that there is a way to understand the great book of nature was fundamental in his shift out of being a Unitarian minister who didn't quite go along with how the church worked, through being part of this transcendentalist community that is all across Europe, to being his own expression, his own unique American expression of these ideas. And this clarity was so important to him. Absolutely important to him. He wanted above all to speak and act from his heart. He really wanted what he truly believed to be expressed. And that's what he did. Sometimes he would lecture in churches. He was often a guest minister. He never joined another church, never was on the staff of any other church. And as the Unitarian Association was being formed, through Channing's work and through the graduates of Harvard Divinity School, he was sometimes called to be a speaker there. And over the course of those experiences, plus Chautauqua, he delivered over 1,500 lectures, many of which became his essays. And he spoke once at the Harvard Divinity School, from which he graduated. And if you look at the next slide, you can see some of the points that he made from the Harvard Divinity School address. All right. And the first point that he makes in the next slide, after the point of being clear, from the Harvard Divinity School address, he says, love is never outgrown. And I really do mean, there we go. And the second point that he made is this thought dwelled always deepest in the minds of men, in the devout and in the contemplative East. And he talked about all of these things. Love is never outgrown. So he's already drawing on all these Eastern traditions in these very early addresses. He said, Europe has always owed its original genius. It's always owed to Oriental genius its divine impulses. Oriental, Egypt, Persia. Persia fed the Judaic tradition. India, it turned out there were Buddhist preachers in Greece before Alexander became the emperor, and so on. So he's recognizing that they've always been part of our Western tradition. And what he says, what these holy bards said from these other places, all sane men found agreeable and true. A lot of this came to him while he was visiting Europe, and he was able to bring some of it home. Then he says and the unique expression or unique impression of Jesus upon mankind, whose name is not so much written as plowed into the history of this word, is proof of the subtle version. I'm sorry, I'm not reading very well. Plowed into the history of this world is proof of the subtle virtue of this infusion, the infusion of the idea that love is never outgrown. And those people who are really devoted to the study of Jesus might say that that was his number one teaching, that love is infinite, love is always present, and love needs to be our first choice. So that's the beginning of the Harvard Divinity School address. It was not a short address, and I'm going to give you a couple more points. So he goes on talking about Jesus in the next slide. He says he belonged to the true race of prophets, right? He saw with open eye the mystery of the soul. Alone in all history, he estimated the greatness of man. And this actually is fundamental to New Thought, the idea that Jesus is alone in all history. Various teachers talk about it in different ways. This is Emerson's way of talking about it. He says, one man was true to what is in you and me. He saw that God incarnates himself in man and evermore goes forth to take possession of his, man's world. Now, this is the 1830s, and everybody's a man, okay? Doesn't matter whether you're male or female or cisgender or bisexual or what. Everyone in that world was a man. So God incarnates God's self in every human being and evermore goes forth to take possession of that person's world. Huge concept that very early on Emerson makes clear. And then he goes on to talk about Christianity. Now, he's at a divinity school, right? And he goes on and says, historical Christianity has fallen into the error that corrupts all attempts to communicate religion. As it appears to us and as it has appeared for ages, it is not the doctrine of the soul, but an exaggeration of the personal, the positive, the ritual. And you can see how that goes. And he goes on to say, and the last point especially, I think no man can go with his thoughts about him into one of our churches without feeling that what hold the public worship had on men is gone or going, right? So he's addressing the realization that what really, really, really was good seems to be gone in the Christian church today. Not exactly what the folks who are running the Harvard Divinity School wanted their keynote speaker to be saying. Next slide, he goes on with his guidelines for ministry graduates. Let me admonish you, he says, first of all, to go alone. Refuse the good models, even those which are sacred. And dare to love God without mediator or veil. Very much contrary to what most people were expecting. Friends enough you'll find who will hold up to your emulation of all these people who have created the church. And then he says, thank God for these good men, but cast behind you all conformity. And some of you may remember that his one of his later essays, he says, a foolish conformity is the hobgoblin of small minds. He really did not think we should conform. And remember what I said about how he grew up and how he was always just on the edge, never quite the same as the people he was with. And then he goes on, acquaint men at first hand, acquaint everyone around you at first hand with deity. Look to it first and only. That is another fundamental piece in New Thought that we will see come up over and over again with our teachers. And then he says, by trusting your own heart, that heart that is always connected with the source, you shall gain more confidence in other beings, which is another piece of New Thought teaching. Finally, on the next slide, he tells us that he's looking for the new teacher, that shall follow so far those shining laws, that he shall see them come full circle, shall see their rounding complete grace, shall see the world to be the mirror of the soul, right? The world is reflecting what we truly are. Shall see the identity of the law of gravitation with purity of heart. And many of us who've explored gravity and the law of attraction and the law of love are realizing there's a lot of similarity there. And then goes on, and shall show that that duty, and notice those are capitalized, is one thing with science, capitalized, with beauty and with joy. That all of that is one and the same. He was never asked to speak to Harvard Divinity School again. But there were phrases in this particular talk that woke people up. People took copies and took notes and published them in papers, and we began to hear about Emerson around the world. And you can see in the next slide, this is the man who was delivering that address. This is a man who is stepping into his own power and ready to move on into the world. So if we look in the next slide, you can see how his lectures are beginning to become essays, that essay Nature, which is a beautiful mixture of poetry and philosophy. I was given the assignment, and I was really hesitant to take it, of interpreting essays by Emerson from his language into modern language so that people could understand them in today's world. We ended up calling that book Natural Abundance. And Natural Abundance is 5 of his essays written in modern language with as much of his poetry as I could hang on to, and with exercises and questions and summary points. And then the back half of the book is the original essays. And I've actually had people say that having read the first part, now they understand Emerson and they've gone on to his other essays. So Natural Abundance with me as the editor, Ruth L. Miller. In any case, his first essay was Nature, and it did come out in 1836. And I love this one paragraph that I have there in quotes. I go with my friend to the shore of our little river, and with one stroke of the paddle, I leave the village politics and personalities, yes, and the world of villages and personalities behind, and pass into a delicate realm of sunset and moonlight, too bright almost to enter. And he talks about awakening to the reality of spirit. He's saying that every natural fact, as he says, is a symbol of some spiritual fact. Anything you look at in the world is a symbol of the spirit at work. And isn't that fundamental, again, to our New Thought movement? In the second phrase there, the whole of nature is a metaphor of the human mind. The laws of physics translate into the laws of ethics. The moral law lies at the center of nature and radiates to the circumference. He was clear that whatever we focused on could be the means by which we were able to access the way that nature, that the universal spirit, that God, that whatever we wanted to call that which is greater than us and moving in and through us could be understood. So in the next slide, we see that during that time, he was in his new home, Bush, outside in Concord, Massachusetts. I had the great joy of going to his home one time, and I'll talk to you about that in a moment. But in 1835, he wrote to a woman who'd attended his lectures, and they seemed to be in sync, and he proposed to her, and she accepted in writing. And so they moved into his house, Bush. They had 4 children. Unfortunately, the first child died. Their neighbors were the Alcotts. Those of you who are familiar with Louisa May Alcott, in her book, Little Women, she's using Emerson as the model. He is the wealthy old man with the son, one of the 3 children that did survive. And Louisa May's house is actually not next door. It's across the way. And when I got to go to Concord a few years back, it was my very first time. And I was so excited. I was headed for Maine, but I saw the sign for Concord and I turned right off that freeway and headed there. And we passed someone reenacting the shot heard around the world on the bridge outside of town. And we came around a corner and I went, oh my goodness, it's right there. And it was the exact house, not Bush, but the Louisa May Alcott house, the house that they grew up in is right there. And it looked exactly like I had long seen it in my mind. And then across the road was Emerson's house as it has been rebuilt. As I was looking at it, I began to realize that I was going to have a very powerful experience. And that experience had to do with how Lydia kept her husband fed. Another neighbor of Ralph Waldo Emerson was the Thoreau household, the widow Thoreau. And the widow Thoreau was left with a son. And at the time when Ralph was still grieving his previous wife's death and his first child's death, Henry David Thoreau became one of his mentees and made it possible for him to continue. So during this period between 1835 and about 1838, Ralph Waldo Emerson bought some land. And on that land was an 11-acre pond that was called Walden Pond. And you can go to Walden Pond today. And there is a replica of the cabin that the young Henry David built on the shore of his neighbor Emerson's pond, Walden Pond, and where he wrote the book that we're all familiar with. So all of that was going on there. And I could feel the presence of these marvelous beings and all the stuff that I had read. And I discovered as I was getting out of the car and walking towards Emerson's house, aware of the Thoreau house nearby and the Alcott house nearby, that I was also aware of a marvelous little book called Mr. Emerson's Cook that describes the young woman from Ireland who answered an ad and came out for an interview in the Emerson household. She wanted to be their cook. And she was 16 years old, this little Irish girl. And she walks up to the house, and there's this very tall man bent over, looking between his legs at her, upside down. And she doesn't quite know what to make of that, and goes up and knocks on the door and has a lovely interview with Mrs. Emerson. And then Mrs. Emerson takes her in to meet Mr. Emerson. And lo and behold, it's this man that she was sure was the gardener looking at her from down, upside down. And he apologizes for giving her a bit of a surprise, but he wanted to see what the world looked like upside down. He always was a little bit on the edge. In any case, I'm walking up to the house, and there, very clearly, right on the edge of the garden next to the house, is a shadow of that man in his upside down state, looking out from between his legs. All right. So now we get to look at the next picture of Mr. Emerson. This is the established lecturer, the one who is being sent out across the country on the railroad trains that are now moving across the country through the Chautauqua process, which is out of a camp in New York where people would come to be invited to lecture. And then people were able to arrange for these lecturers at the camp to move out across the country. So that brings us to the next several years, the next 4 or 5 years, 1836 to 1840. Whenever he was home, he and Henry David Thoreau, Walt Whitman, Bronson Alcott, Louisa May's dad, and a bunch of others would gather together in the town hall, which was also the schoolhouse and the church for Concord, Massachusetts, and form the Transcendentalist Club, which is described in the next slide. Originally, they called it the Hedges Club. It was also called the Symposium, but they decided on Transcendentalist Club. Mostly it was the people around them. It was just a bunch of young men, each of whom had some marvelous ideas and wanted the opportunity to express those in front of others. And it was not unusual. In fact, those of you who are familiar with the Lord of the Rings or the Narnia books may want to know that both Tolkien and just lost his name. Oh, that's terrible. That there was a circle of guys who got together and talked. at the time. And so, yeah, as we see, that's what's going on here in Concord. That's how Whitman is developing his own capacity to be writing poetry and reading poetry. It's how Thoreau is cementing his ideas. And periodically, Waldo would get up and share his ideas. They met every Wednesday, and when he was in town, he'd be there. And then a woman named Margaret Fuller, who became a reporter, began to collect what they were saying, and she published a little magazine called The Dial, which lasted until 1844, and then she went on to New York as a reporter. These were very, very popular, not just with students from around the area, and not just with intellectuals who needed something to entertain them. Remember, there wasn't any TV or movies or anything like that. But even people that were kind of a surprise, and this is described on this slide. One neighbor saw the woman who cleaned his house in the audience one night, and he asked her the next day if she understood what Mr. Emerson had said. And she replied in her deep New England accent, "Not a word, but I like to go and see him stand up there and look as though he thought everyone was as good as he is." And that was a huge part of what Emerson offered us, right? If we go on further, we see the essay, The American Scholar, and that really cemented, as you can see in the next slide, that really cemented his idea of being the American philosopher. This went out, and his career was on full speed from here on out. And Mr. President and gentlemen, this confidence in the unsearched might of man belongs by all motives, by all prophecy, by all preparation to the American scholar. We have listened too long to the courtly muses of Europe. That line got published across the country, and everyone wanted to meet the American philosopher. So in the next slide, you can see some of these new ideas that he presents, the beauty of the soul, right? That it's the beauty, there is this one is the reality. He calls it the seal, like a seal that has a carving in it. The other is the print. Nature is the complement of the soul. The one is, you can see them reflecting in each other. And if we go on to the next slide, he offered more new ideas. He talked about the identity of all minds, right? That there is one mind, he said in his essay, History, one mind common to all humanity, and everyone is the inlet and outlet of the same. Those of you who've been in religious science may possibly have heard that phrase once or twice. Moving on with the American scholar, he would go down, he said, in the secrets of my own mind, one is descended into the secrets of all minds. It cannot be enshrined in a single person. The near explains the far. And as we go on, he starts introducing more of what was called Orientalism in the next slide. And then I'm going to go skip over to Chautauqua. The mid-1860s through the 70s, this is where he actually got to meet John Muir, President Lincoln, Samuel Clemens, Mark Twain, and Bret Harte. So he's meeting all these poets that he really wanted to be, all these other kinds of speakers and beings. So when we get to the next slide, we see after this period of lecturing, this is the person, this older person, and sitting at his desk, in the photograph of Ralph Waldo Emerson, the classic. And after the Chautauqua lectures, he has established himself in that next slide. And that is the older man that Louisa May Alcott is writing about. She has grown up seeing the other one, but her book takes place in the 60s and 70s. And that's the man that she knew. In the next slide, we see that he's completing a life. 1872, his house is burned. Most of his library got saved by the neighbors. They loved him. They built and rebuilt his house. He personally began to fail. It was as if the house held his memory. His lungs started to have problems. His daughter took him to Egypt. He finally got to see Egypt in the last years of his life. And finally, he fell asleep and passed away in 1882. So Mr. Emerson is the philosopher that established what we call the New Thought philosophy. We're going to be referring back to some of these slides and all of these ideas henceforth. Thanks for joining me here on the Roots and Branches of New Thought on the New Thought Media Network. Blessed be.